Hey everyone, and welcome to 412 Kids. This is the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette's parenting podcast. My name is Abby Mackey. I am your host. I am a registered nurse with most of my experience in pediatrics, but none of those qualifications matter as much today as the fact that I am a born and bred Pittsburgher, as we consider whether modern Pittsburgh parents should allow Pittsburghese, the distinct way that we speak in our region, to persist in their tiny Yinzers. And to do that, we first have to understand a little bit more about what Pittsburghese is. Is it a distinct dialect or is it something else? And we also have to think about the cultural implications. If speaking a certain way has the power to unite a group, which I would say that it does, if you consider the pride that exists in Pittsburgh and in the way that we speak, we have to wonder whether it should be honored in that way. And to start thinking about those things, we're going to lean on the expertise of two people, starting with Dr. Scott Kiesling. He's a linguist at the University of Pittsburgh. Here he is. So we're joined by Dr. Scott Kiesling. He is the chair of the Department of Linguistics at the University of Pittsburgh. He has a PhD in linguistics from Georgetown. He is also the author of a book entitled Pittsburgh Speech and Pittsburghese in 2015. So he truly is a Pittsburghese expert. And I really think probably your biggest claim to fame is that Wikipedia page that's out there about you. So you said something about it was a grad student who created that for you?
Yeah, at some other university actually. So there is a little bit of recognition there, I guess. But you're not supposed to create your own Wikipedia page, so someone is supposed to do that for you. So it's quite an honor.
Yeah, just like naming a new species, so long as you're not arrogant enough to do it yourself, it's fine that it's out there. So, I am a native Pittsburgher. I have grandparents from the South Side Slopes. My mother, I have many people in my family who speak with this thick accent, right? Now, those of us who are from here or have spent some time here, we know what Pittsburghese means, right? So we're pronouncing words differently than other people. We have sort of odd grammatical rules, like leaving out to be verbs in certain sentences. We also we're making up our own words, right? So, my mom would say, "Read up your room." So to you as a linguist, what are the nuts and bolts of what is happening here? Is this a dialect? Is this an accent? Is it something all its own that we're just going to call Pittsburghese forever? What is going on?
Yeah, there's a lot of social work going on here in terms of what we hear and what we don't hear. The famous quote is that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. So in this case, we have a dialect, but we don't have an army and navy. But there's really, you can look at it from a scientific standpoint, in which case we would say that's what we're doing when we're describing Pittsburgh speech. And then we can also look at it from a social standpoint, where we're talking about Pittsburghese, which is the thing that people talk about, the features of Pittsburgh speech that people pick on when they're saying, "I'm from Pittsburgh, I'm going to show you by saying read up or needs washed," or something like that. And so we usually make that distinction of the things we can describe, which are a lot more and sometimes less than what people call Pittsburghese, and then the Pittsburghese, which is this social thing that people identify and they put in dictionaries and they put on T-shirts and things like that. So there's kind of a difference there, and it just depends on how you're approaching the way that people speak.
Now, in preparing for this, I was researching a little bit of this on my own, and it sounds like, now you tell me, you know better than I do, but it sounds like in your field that people are getting away from even using the term dialect versus accent, because sometimes they come with some negative connotations that people are trying to get rid of, and that the word, I believe, variation is being used more often now.
Variety, yeah.
Or variety, okay.
Yeah, because there is kind of a connotation that a dialect is somehow not as good as a standard language. And if you look at it scientifically, really, a standard language is a dialect of a language just like every other dialect. But we often think of sort of the dialect as coming down from the standard language. And really we can show that isn't the case, that it is this kind of, they're all equal in scientific terms. So we do talk about variety because it's much more neutral in terms of thinking about that relationship. And it just doesn't say, there's a clear boundary between this one and that one. So yeah, we do usually use variety rather than dialect.
Now, I feel like all of that was essential information to get us going on our primary topic, which is whether or not modern Pittsburgh parents should allow Pittsburghese to persist in their children. And Dr. Kiesling and I had a little bit of a conversation before we got going, and it sounds like maybe the more essential question is whether parents even have the power to change it.
Yeah. I mean, it depends on how much influence parents have, which is not always a lot. But one of the things that we find in terms of how kids learn dialect or variety or their local ways of speaking is that when they're young, they really do mimic the way their parents talk. They use a lot of the same variety accents, etc. And then when they get to sort of middle school and high school, the peers are much more important. So it's very possible that, just like parents trying to influence teenagers' behavior forever, any other behavior like language, in some cases it's going to be completely impossible to have any effect. And very likely it's most of the time it's not going to have any effect. You can see this kind of, kids that grow up in a home that, for example, in Pittsburgh, where you speak Mandarin Chinese and they speak Mandarin Chinese all the time at home, they learn to grow up speaking that, but then they go to school and they learn to speak perfectly good Pittsburgh English. They may even have a Pittsburgh, what we would call Pittsburghese if they grow up here. And so it really is as much, if not more, your peers and how they speak that influence how you talk as it is your parents. You certainly get some stuff from your parents, but your peers are really important as well. So there's only so much that the parents are going to be able to do there.
Now, I'm sure just like anything else, it probably depends on the relationship with the parents, as you said, and also maybe their tenacity too, right?
Yeah.
Because I am the product, and coincidentally, my husband too, where we had one parent with a very thick Pittsburgh accent and one parent who was vehemently opposed to the idea of Pittsburghese. So each and every time we said catch, we heard about it, right? And that's why we don't say it as adults.
Yeah. And that also trains you to pay attention. So, you just did a perfect imitation of it, which means how it's supposed to sound, right? Mm-hmm. So you have it in there somewhere, but that when, for example, when you're on a podcast, that's not the language you're going to use, right? I would bet that you probably could do a really good imitation of a Pittsburghese accent. But, because you've heard it, but you also have had this input like, okay, this is not good. Here's the other way to speak, and I'm going to speak that way. And you've made that decision. Somebody else who has a different orientation or wants to do something different with their life or has a different kind of identity might decide, oh no, I'm going to be a Yinzer, so to speak. And I want to do that. And I want to be a Pittsburgher. And so I'm going to talk like that. And so there is this sense of sort of agency and willfulness of sort of where you want to put yourself, what your identity is going to be and things like that. So
that's a really good way to get into speaking about Pittsburghese, whether it's a dialect or anything else, culturally, right? Mm-hmm. Because I have a background in anthropology, so I feel really strongly about this part of it, So, something like a dialect is like any other piece of culture, something that's going to unite groups. We kind of rally around this in the way that we rally around a Steeler game. And so in that way, is it anything that people should even try to think about getting rid of?
I would say no, because you're sort of celebrating your Pittsburgh identity. Mm-hmm. I think that's going to have to be up to each person, knowing sort of what if you want to say the costs or benefits, or, what kind of identity do they want to have? There's a really lovely paper that my colleague Barbara Johnstone, who used to work at CMU, wrote about when there was a news story about Pittsburghese that came out, and then people started commenting on it. People from what I call the Pittsburgh diaspora, all the people who go to Steelers bars in like Austin, Texas, they would write in and just start naming Pittsburghese, right? So it had this function of sharing. No, look, I'm over here, but I am a Pittsburgher because I know what red up means, right? I know what a sweeper is and those sorts of things. So there really is an identity function. So even if they're not speaking what we would think of as Pittsburghese every day, they do know that. So there is really, you're right, there's this cultural connection that people make in terms of identity and sharing being from Pittsburgh. And really, one of the reasons why we have such a strong knowledge about Pittsburghese is the fact that we do have a lot of Pittsburghers who had to leave in the 80s and 90s. And that was their sort of connection to Pittsburgh. And that was when people really noticed, oh, I talk differently than all these other people. And it was pointed out to them. And then it became part of their identity. And so then they can come back and share that and be part of the Pittsburgh identity. Steelers Nation is the best way probably to call it. So yeah, so it's definitely something that I think is something that's valuable. I've actually had somebody ask me a little bit about, is Pittsburgh losing the Pittsburgh accent? And the answer to that is I have no idea because I haven't tested it, but I think there might be a little bit of that going on because of partially because people know about it so much, and so they're trying to like not do that. But yeah, so the story's still out on that one. But
Well, okay, so being sort of a tech hub,
yeah,
right? And a medical hub, we are attracting people from all over the country, all over the world. Though you haven't tested it, I would say that it's intuitive to say that by doing that, you're just sort of diluting that part of culture, or maybe all parts of Pittsburgh culture. Who knows?
yeah, yeah. And actually, there was a study in Raleigh, North Carolina, 15 years ago or something like that, where they had a similar pattern where there was a lot of tech development and a lot of people came from outside the South, and they found that their southern vowels were kind of disappearing a little bit in the Raleigh area. So it's something that has actually happened before.
So neurologically, as children are developing, is there anything that we know about these dialects and how they interpret them? That a child raised in Pittsburgh with parents who speak Pittsburghese, that they could listen to someone from Louisiana and for the most part know everything that they're saying.
Yeah. Well, we're really good at figuring that stuff out. Like sort of when we talk to people, where we sort of signal whether we're understanding, and so they know whether to revise things.
Hmm.
So we can figure that out. If it's close enough, we just make guesses, right? Knowing, okay, this is basically the same way, same language. This is going to be one of 5 words probably in this slot, so that's the way it is. And then once you've heard somebody for a while, you've really got this idea of what it sounds like. So once you've heard, when you first hit a dialect that's really different and really strange, try going to Scotland sometime for real. You can almost not understand anything, but then you start to sort of calibrate and you understand sort of how to translate into things, and then you get the idea of what's going on. And as humans, we're set up to do that. We're set up to be multilingual, multidialectal. It's just the human condition. And so, someone who only speaks one way, someone who only speaks one language is actually not less common than someone who speaks more than one language in the world. But someone who only speaks the same way all the time is really weird. Like, can you imagine like just speaking the same way, the way you talk on your podcast all the time to everybody? Like that would you would be weird and people would think you were weird. So there's always this kind of variation, and we're set up to notice that kind of stuff. So yes, neurologically, we're set up to do that, partially because language is a social thing, and that helps us navigate the social world to know sort of what's this person's attitude, what kind of person are they, even where are they from, right? Oh, this person's from Pittsburgh. I'm going to be nicer to them because I'm also from Pittsburgh.
I didn't always live here, and that was absolutely true. And it was also true, sort of coming at it from a different angle of what you were saying before. You can pick out someone who is from where you are from when you
Yeah,
have a dialect like we have. And that's like the most exciting thing that happens in your whole week when you get to find a Pittsburgher in the wild.
yeah, yeah,
So
absolutely.
I wonder, for you as a linguist, as an academic, if Pittsburgh was maybe especially attractive to you because of this dialect thing we have going on. And a little bit earlier, you said that there's something about Pittsburghers. We are way more into ourselves, way more into our own Pittsburghese than people are in other areas.
Yeah, that was one of the reasons why we wanted to do this project. There are a lot of projects that sort of describe, this is the way people speak in this place. But it really struck me and Barbara Johnstone, my colleague, and we really worked on this project together. It really struck us how much the being a Pittsburgher was also connected to speaking in a particular way, which is not always quite so central. So, you didn't always find it in certain things. I actually saw a T-shirt in Dick's Sporting Goods the other day, and it was a nice women's T-shirt, and it said Yinz girl or something on it, right? And it was right in the middle in the display. You don't usually see that in other places. So even in like New York City, which is people are very aware of that dialect, you don't see a lot of those sorts of things, right? So Pittsburgh really was intriguing to us from that perspective, and sort of wondering, well, why is that the case here? Why is it so important? So yeah, that was really, really part of it, the motivation for doing the study.
Now, as you said, it's all a matter of opinion, but based on everything you've told us so far, it sounds like in ways you could honor your Pittsburghese like you honor your pierogies, or
Yeah.
you honor, the way your grandfather made the ham on Easter, that it is that much a part of culture, right? But we also talked
Yeah.
about
Mhm.
how our city in general is attracting a lot of people from a lot of different areas. And so we right now could be talking to parents who aren't from here.
Yeah.
And maybe they really don't have much of a connection to the sound of the way that we speak, and they really don't want their kids to talk this way.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about how they might go about not having tiny Yinzers.
So the important thing is to point out that there's a difference in ways of speaking, right? So this is how some people in Pittsburgh speak. It can be evaluated in a particular way. Do you want to be evaluated in that way? And so if you want to sort of do that, then you can show that, and then the kids can make their choice. And it might be that they use some Pittsburghese for a while they're in school. We often find that people use more what we call a standard variety when people get into the workforce, and then when they get older and they really don't care anymore, they go back to speaking however they want. But really, it's kind of the adolescent period is when people speak the most non-standard. So that's the other thing, is don't worry too much when someone is a teenager if they're using a lot of non-standard speech, because that's what teenagers do. And that's, our language is always changing. That's how it changes. The young people come up with new ways of speaking, and they innovate, and it sounds weird and horrible to adults. And it has always been that way, and it will always be that way. So don't panic too much. You can grumble a little bit because it gives them a little satisfaction to annoy you if speaking in a weird way. But I don't think it's something to worry too much about, because the kids are going to make their own decisions. But you can point out that there's a difference, because you don't know if they're going to hear it, and then they'll adjust accordingly, probably.
Well, that was Dr. Scott Kiesling, a linguist from the University of Pittsburgh. And just so our listeners are clear, there are only a few names that anyone references when it comes to expertise in Pittsburghese. And Dr. Kiesling is absolutely one of those names. So we are so grateful to him for joining us on 412 Kids. He laid such a fantastic foundation for us. Now, to move on to speaking about maybe how people view dialects, and specifically Pittsburghese, as a negative socially, and then also a little bit more of what it means to be bidialectal and maybe where else in society we see those dynamics. We're going to move on to a clinical psychologist from Carnegie Mellon University. I'm talking about Dr. Brian McWhinney, and he's an expert in language acquisition. He's currently contributing to a database full of information about how people acquire their primary language, their secondary language, even some specialty cases such as people who stutter or who experience aphasia. So we're going to learn a little bit more about all of this from Dr. McWhinney. Here he is.
So my kids, we moved in from Denver back in '81, and we went to down in Turtle Creek, Turtle Creek,
Yeah.
and they became essentially bidialectal. But really, in our home, we didn't use Pittsburghese that much. Although over time, it starts to move in on you a little bit.
Right, whether you want it to or not.
Even in the articulation, yeah.
So from your seats, and this could be somewhat opinion, well-founded opinion, but are there negatives to children adopting a dialect like Pittsburghese? Because obviously, in some parts of the country, a dialect is more pronounced than others. As you said, in some areas of Pittsburgh, within some family groups, it can be very pronounced.
Yeah.
Are there negatives to that? Should parents consider trying to eradicate it from their kids' speech?
Yeah, well, I hate to say that a lot of this is just discrimination by powerful people who have already locked into more of the national dialect, and so for them, this would be a sign of being lower class, working class.
Mhm.
And I think that's a real effect that parents are probably reacting to. Let me give you an extreme example of that. Is on the Navajo reservation, where children learn Navajo as little ones, but then as soon as they go to school, or even before, the parents start to tell them, just don't speak Navajo anymore. When you're going out in the job market, all you're going to have to do is speak English. So a lot of Native American children are losing their native languages. So, and it's a shame because they're beautiful languages and they form the community and everything. So,
Right.
so I think you have to think about both sides of this coin. Do you want to be part of their family and your community, or do you want to, just give up everything so that you can get a higher salary, basically? So, and well, in the Navajo reservation, of course, it's extreme because there's so much poverty on the reservation. But, you can get by fine still speaking Pittsburghese.
Sure.
Yeah,
Sure.
right.
No, well, the question you just posed there about whether it's worth it to give up everything in order to make money is probably the central question of our entire morality as a
Yeah,
country,
sure.
not just language. But in this case, I have a background in anthropology. I'm passionate about the cultural side of this too. There's really something to be said, I think, for holding on to these things that
Absolutely.
identify your group,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, sure. So much of the ethnic tradition of Pittsburgh and really the whole of the lore and everything is still locked into, now, it's not that Pittsburgh speaks some of these sound changes are also found in Ohio and elsewhere, but this area and this particular configuration of features is really unique to Pittsburgh. So yeah, no, I think that it should be highly valued. At the same time, if it could be understood as a bidialectal situation, that's probably the optimal.
Yeah, that's an interesting take, right? So when our kids grow up, maybe they're hanging out with their buddies, maybe they're at a bar or at a sporting
Exactly.
event or
Right.
something, and they want to speak true Pittsburghese, go do it then, right? Just
Right.
maybe have the ability to drop it or tamp it down when you need to.
Well, that's what my kids basically picked up to some degree. Another example of this is code switching, which is an interesting thing between two languages, like in Miami or Southern California, between Spanish and English. There you have even a more radical thing where people in one sentence you use some English and then you switch over to Spanish, and
Mm.
and what that shows is that you're a member of both communities. And you often say certain things in a certain way because they are unique to that community, and other things in another way because they're unique to that community. So, things like official documents and everything, promotion at jobs is going to be in English, whereas if talking about your family or food is in Spanish. So that's, I think people have to loosen up a little bit and go with the flow, but really you really do need to probably master both levels.
When we have parents who say, I don't want my child to develop Pittsburghese, maybe
Mhm.
because they aren't Pittsburgh natives, they have no emotional connection to this, they just don't like the sound of it, whatever it is.
Mhm.
Do you
That's
have any advice from your seat as to help them avoid having their children speak this way?
Well, yeah. I mean, that's interesting, and that also most kind of assumes that their children are not going to associate with other kids that speak Pittsburghese. So it's a little radical, but I think that children in that position are really not an issue. They're going to pick up the main dialect as the major. They have their teachers, and in the classroom, the dialect, the main standard dialects being used. So the motive for picking up Pittsburghese is really secondary, and they'll pick up some, and it's really not going to hurt them. So I would I would relax about that, basically.
That seems to be the theme with so many parenting topics. It's just go on with it. It's okay.
We've got other problems with the kids, and I think that learning Pittsburghese is one of the lowest down the line.
But it
Obviously,
is an
what
interesting
they're doing
topic.
online. Yeah,
All right. Dr. McWhinney, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
yeah. Thank you. Yeah,
Of
great.
course. Okay, Yinz. Well, I don't know about you, but I am feeling super full of Pittsburgh pride after those conversations with Drs. Kiesling and McWhinney. Thank you so much to both of them for joining us. And that Pittsburgh pride has me extra excited to move into our 412 for You segment, which for the first time includes a Pittsburgher product. So I am talking about a new book, a children's book called Why It's for Yinz by Jamie Cavallero. Now, if you're listening to this podcast, that means that the associated story is already available at post-gazette.com. And so if you haven't caught on to this yet, when I write a story associated with a 412 Kids podcast, there are things in that story that don't make the podcast, and there are things in the podcast that don't make the story. So there are reasons to consume both. So I hope that you do that. And in today's story is Jamie Cavallero, and she is a native Pittsburgher who has moved to Colorado, and she also writes children's books. Her most recent one is this book, Y is for Yinz. And guys, this is an adorable book. My son had me read it to him twice this morning at his request. And one thing I love is the dedication page at the front. It says, "This book is dedicated to the good people of Pittsburgh." And the whole thing speaks to exactly what we said throughout this conversation, that this way of speaking differently is a way to unite people, a way to make us feel like home. And that's what the feeling I get while reading this whole book. It's available on Amazon if you'd like to look it up. Second thing, last Saturday, the Children's Museum of Pittsburgh opened a brand new exhibit called How People Make Things. And this is inspired by Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood factory tours. So I love it already. Anything Mr. Rogers, I am in. It makes me feel good. So kids can use items that are used in manufacturing. So things like a die cutter. They can cut and shape wax using different tools. They can assemble a trolley, nothing more Mr. Rogers than that, and make it go on a track. It is free with admission, and it's already up and running, so you can go see it whenever you want. And coming up this weekend is the River Life Chalk Fest. Now, if you've never been to a Chalk Fest, I have to tell you, I think they're incredible. I don't know how these artists use their minds to create such large pieces of art, and then also all of the shading and everything that goes on in chalk pieces. I just think it's gorgeous and so worth your time. So May 25th, from 1 to 6 p.m. and then May 26th from 9 to 2 at Allegheny Landing on the North Shore. There are going to be chalk art, chalk artists, local food, and drinks. Sounds like a great time. So I have been your host. My name is Abby Mackey. Our editor is Polly Higgins. Our producers are Jacob Comer and Matt Rosenberg. And as always, from all of us here at the Post-Gazette, it is our privilege to be on this journey with you and your 412 kids. We'll see you next time.